Welcome to Meanwhile at the Museum, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes with the people, stories, and shenanigans that make Cincinnati Museum Center what it is. I'm Cody Hefner, and I'm joined today by Katherine Gould. Did you ever get that? Did you ever get like the
ballpark announcing?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, well.
I don't even have a walk-up song. I need to think about that.
Ooh. All right. We'll come back to that. That's good. Katherine, you are a curator of history objects and fine art.
Yes.
I did not even have to look that up. I knew that off the top of my head. And as of this recording, you are one day away from your 2-year anniversary here.
Yes.
I just saw that in an email.
Yes. Almost 2 years.
I remember your first day here.
I don't.
You don't? I think your first day here, we were moving machine tools into the Made in Cincinnati gallery.
Yes.
Mitch was filming. It's always very interesting. It's such a process to watch, these big, massive things come into a historic building.
Yep.
Especially in spaces that are not like the loading dock. So just what doors open up to the exterior, and let's crank them in that way. That was your first day?
That's right, because we had to assemble the bedstead that day.
Yeah, the Henry Boyd bed. Mm-hmm. A big old cauldron.
Yep.
From Castfab, a Castfab ladle.
The safe.
The safe, I think
that came in.
The Mosler safe.
Mm-hmm. Love it.
Look at me, man. I know. Made in Cincinnati pretty well. It's probably my strongest new exhibit for some reason.
Spend time with stuff and it sticks.
All right, so you didn't remember your first day, but I'm glad we could jog your memory. But remembering old events, that's kind of your wheelhouse, right?
Right.
So tell us a little bit about your role here. What does that mean? Also, this is not a visual medium, but I love that you have a little teacup of water, so it feels real late night show.
Fancy?
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, Mitch, we should get branded mugs for water for people.
There you go.
All right.
Just say vodka on the side.
Could it say vodka on the side?
Vodka, yeah.
It could say vodka inside.
I mean, I don't know what you guys do with beer, but yeah.
Is that how you party at our collections facility?
What happens there stays there.
Okay, fair enough.
Awesome. So, question, what do I do?
Yeah.
All right. I care for the history object collection and the fine art collection. Right now, I'm spending a lot of time kind of working on processing backlog, getting everything documented. We're really making a push to trying to get the collection online. So we will have a new online interface, searchable database for that. So working on getting objects photographed, that sort of thing. Collecting. I do a lot of collecting. The history of Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky, the region. I work a lot with researchers, both in-house and out-of-house. I help with exhibits when necessary. Facilitate loans, all different kinds of things, but with the history object collection and the fine art collection.
All right, so you said working through backlogs.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean right now?
So we have a lot of stuff.
My dad was a plumber, and when he worked through backlogs, it meant something different.
Right. So we have a lot of stuff, and caring for it takes a lot of time and effort. And back in the day, so I just generally refer to as ago, we acquired a lot of stuff, more than we could take care of at the time with the staff that we have. And so things pile up. So just going through and getting it documented, researching the source file, articulating what the provenance is, which is the story of the object, getting that into the database, making sure things are properly boxed and stored and numbered and that sort of thing. So
sometimes it's you get this influx of materials, and it's all right, let's get it in and get it taken care of or put it in a secure place, and then we'll do all the paperwork later.
Right. So now's later.
Now's later. Because the history collections really go back 1831.
Yes, they go before we were technically like a museum. We were still just the historical society, but they were bringing in three-dimensional objects. A lot of fine art was coming in the 1800s. The date of the objects, regardless of when they were acquired, do go back quite far. But we've been collecting for a long time, and most of the staff were either librarians or archivists, and so things were brought in and put on shelves. And multiply that over decades, and you're just going to get a backlog. And so every curator before me has been working on backlog. So it's just what you need to do, plus keeping on top of the things that I'm bringing in, that I'm collecting as well. So all museums have it. Backlog, it needs to be worked through. Standards change, so how we used to do things, we now do them differently or more completely, and so you want to bring everything up to the standard that you're working to now. So it's just, a lot of playing with the toys, playing with the stuff, which is fun.
It's kind of by the time you've cataloged everything, it's almost like you're going back to the start and you're recataloging as standards change and as information changes and things.
Right. So something came in 20, 30 years ago and you included the information that you knew at the time. The internet's changed a lot. You can do a lot more genealogy research. A lot more resources are now online, so you can do a lot more in-depth research on the people who owned it or the event that's around it or what the thing itself is. You can find a lot more information on it. So updating the record with that new information, more robust history, gives us more stories that we can tell and gives more relevance to the object being in the collection, because the relevance part of it is really important.
And then putting them online, that's not so you can find them. It's not like someone organizing their files on their computer. This is for researchers and public to search through the collections and as they're doing research, right?
Right. We've got a wonderful historical object collection, and objects are primary resources, right? They provide insight into our values, societal values, personal values, cultural values. They reflect our politics and our economics. So they're wonderful research pieces, but people have to know that we have them so that they can use them for their research. So getting them online is so other people can discover them.
That's something interesting that I'm just now realizing. I studied history in college, and it's always about documents. Mm-hmm. It's always about using documents for research, and you don't, there's not a lot of programs on how to use materials, how to use 3D objects for research. And obviously a lot of universities aren't going to have access to those or to as many of those. What do you think the value is of looking at the objects themselves and the stories that they can tell beyond just written material?
All material objects have value and meaning, right? Sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's cultural or societal, but there is story in everything. And they can fill in where the written record is absent, right? Collections reflect a survival bias in a lot of ways. They're the things that had the resilience to survive, the things we cared for and treated well. Even the archival record, that reflects the written word, right? The things that people did and said. But it was people who could read and write. So what about the stories of those who couldn't? Objects can fill in those areas. Objects, depending on the material, can survive a lot longer than documents. So there's a complement, and also they can kind of fill in the hole for that. But objects, like I said earlier, reflect what we value in society, what we care for, what we want to keep. And they can say a lot about who we are personally, who we are as a community. And they're just, I think, a wonderful insight into the past that can tell you a lot of different stories also. There's never just one story with an object. You can tell multiple stories with objects. But they're just wonderful reflections and insights into the past.
Before we started recording, you said we should do a series where we go into people's offices and we just cherry pick an item in their office and make them explain it, because objects do give insight into to who we are historically and today. I mean, everyone has stuff in their office. They have, family photos or photos of their pets or something. They have all these knickknacks and things like that. Their office may be very curated to really show who they are. Mine is not. A lot of the stuff in my office, you stood in my office and you said, "Oh, clutter gives me anxiety."
A lot of inflatables.
Inflatable ducks and whales, yes. Just to be clear. But I remember we had a gentleman who worked here. He was a rabbi. He was pretty buttoned up, but had all these Yoda toys and dolls and all this other stuff that was in his office that just showed a completely different side of who he was. What always fascinates me about history are they're real people. It's not just George Washington, the president, the leader of the Continental Army. he was sending personal letters as well. He, had a home life and all this other stuff. Not necessarily some of the embarrassing stuff, but what's some of the personal stuff that he has lying around his house, and that tells a completely different story. And thinking of our curatorial team, you deal with objects that have survived.
Right.
Bob Gamheimer kind of deals with objects that didn't or weren't meant to, because he's looking through privy shafts and these trash pits and things like that. And then you're also working with Christine Ingalls, who's our archivist, who has a lot of written documents. And so sometimes you're using all three to tell a story of, the city at a certain time, or, a certain class of citizen at a certain time. How do you all collaborate? How often are you going back and forth with each other to say, I have this object, do you have anything that tells me more about it?
All the time. Oftentimes we collect kind of parallel with each other. Oftentimes we collect complementary, like I'll have a thing and archives will have something that supports that, or they'll have something and I'll have an object that's evidence of something being written. For example, literally last week, Christine transferred to the objects collection a piece of rope that she found in one of the manuscript collections. And it's just this little 3-inch segment of rope. It doesn't look like anything. It's no different than like a stubby end of a cigar. About 3 inches long, about 3/4 of an inch thick. It was cut off from a longer rope. Looking at it, that means nothing, right? But the context provided through the archive material that Christine has, this was actually a segment of rope that was cut from the noose that was used to hang a gentleman by the name of Ben Jonson in 1884. And he had been tried and convicted of murdering a family to sell their bodies to the Ohio Medical College. So suddenly this rope, right, that looks like something that you would just throw away, has incredible meaning to it, right?
Yeah.
So that story, that personal association, that was proven with the documents that it came on with. So it was collected by this guy who's actually given a permit to attend the hanging at the courthouse in 1884. And he was given a segment of this rope by someone he identified as a sheriff. That day, he wrote a letter to his brother explaining what this is and mailing it to him because he said, I know you like to collect relics. So we have the archives that documents what this object is, which by itself would look like nothing. So the archives is supporting the provenance and story of this object, which now has incredible meaning.
And then that one object is spinning off to like 3 or 4 stories.
Right.
What is it? Oh, it's from a noose. Why was this person hanged? All right, let's get into that story. But let's back up. Why would someone keep this? How did they get it? It's
right. And it's in
from
the letter.
A 3-inch rope.
Yeah, and it's in that letter. And it can tell the broader story of you can tell the story of the hanging of Ben Jonson, I think I said his name was.
Yeah.
But then also, if you look at the era, you had this thing of, they were called resurrectionists, where they were basically stealing bodies from cemeteries to sell to medical colleges to use in anatomy classes. That was a thing, right? So now you've got a larger story that you can tell with this 3-inch piece of rope.
Okay, but what about the medical college who knowingly is buying stolen bodies in the name of science? But all these doctors in the 1800s, they're trained on stolen corpses.
Yeah, it's an interesting little part of history. Yeah, I was actually just kind of doing deeper research into it yesterday, so I could catalog the record and eventually get this online. But yeah, I found a newspaper article just like summarizing the whole thing from 1884 online, which 30 years ago it might not have been online, so you might not have had all the context to
go
it.
And scroll on the little the microfiche or whatever.
Right.
I think CIA is the only people who use that anymore.
Librarians like it, I bet.
Sure, they're librarians. I bet Jill Bites is a librarian,
right? She
not a CIA agent.
Loves her microfiche. So now this little 3-inch piece of rope has an incredible story to tell, which by itself, without the archival documentation, we wouldn't know what that is. So our collections overlap a lot. I kind of joke what Bob does is below ground and I'm above ground, but they're both material culture, right? we're collecting the things that document our historical past.
Do you and Bob connect over toilet humor? Because he's digging in these 19th century toilets a lot.
Hmm.
And you have a barrel of toilet supplies, right?
Yes, I do.
We talked about this once.
Yes, it's from the Cold War era. It's I think its technical name is like the SK4 sanitation kit, whatever. And it's basically a cardboard barrel that's, I don't know, about 3 feet tall, and it contains within it supplies to last for 50 people in a fallout shelter for a month. And what you do is you take the supplies out and the bag that they're in, and you use the bag to line the barrel, which then becomes essentially the toilet.
50 people for a month.
I think so, yeah.
So that's 150 human days worth of poop in a barrel.
Right.
In a fallout shelter.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So what's the research and development like for something like that?
Thankfully we didn't need to use it because...
But someone had to test it, right?
Somebody did the math on this, right? But within it is only 10 rolls of government-supplied toilet paper.
That's not enough.
That's not enough.
That's not enough for 30.
And I was actually reading through one of the manuals, and when it's full, they advise you to do one of two things. Close it up, like tie up the bag and close it up and put it in the farthest corner, or if there isn't one, just open the door and put it outside, which at that
point... Put it in
point,
the radiation.
You're irradiated. So it's kind of, not.
At that point, you might want to be.
Really? Yeah.
Was there a toilet seat with it? So, all right, hold on. Are you... Are people...
You want to crack this open, don't you?
I do. How are people pooping this? Are they pooping elsewhere and then, like, putting it in the barrel, or are they climbing on top of the barrel?
I think they're just...
Is there a toilet seat with it in the barrel?
I don't think there is. I think it's just leaning over and doing what you need to do. I haven't thought that deeply into it,
No,
honestly.
You haven't? Oh my God.
I know. But yes, it's not ideal. But then again, you're talking about nuclear war. So
right.
At the end of the day, is it gonna matter?
It's like if you're stranded in the middle of the ocean on a raft, you're not thinking about, pristine conditions. How am I going to brush my teeth today? All that stuff. You're thinking about surviving. But then again, if you're in a shelter with 50 people, with 10 rolls of toilet paper, it's going to get Lord of the Flies real fast.
Yeah. Yeah. It's...
And what are you eating? What's the can? All those canned goods, that's not going to be good for the barrel.
Not
Let me tell
really.
You that much.
They're not the greatest food. A lot of crackers, like saltine type crackers, shelf stable foods.
That's probably that probably binds you up a little bit.
Probably. So again, it's not the most ideal of circumstances, but as an artifact, it's wonderful to look at the values that we had in the 50s, that this was a real threat. Like when talk about the Cold War, they meant it. They were making plans and preparations. It was more than just, hide under your desk kind of things. There were supplies and fallout shelters all over the country. It was a huge project. And this is some of the material evidence that we have of the work that went into preparing for the potential of a nuclear war.
It does show the breadth of thinking and planning that you're getting to that level of it, because I think thinking of food and thinking of the shelters is one thing. It's pretty easy, but then you start to spin that out and what's life like in that shelter and for how long.
Yeah. And I also have a couple 100 pounds of those shelf-stable saltine crackers. So
we need to crack them open and try them. What's the shelf life on those? I mean, it's got to be pretty long.
I mean, they're saltines. Do they go bad?
Did they ever start good?
Well, there's the question. These kinds of things are actually, you can find them in Army surplus stores also. So if you want to try them, you can. It's not impossible. So.
Okay. Well, so that to me is it's a strange object, but it does it tells a great story, and it's an important story. What are some of the strangest things you've come across in our collections? And do you
Well,
have a favorite?
strange is relative. I like the ordinary to the point of it being kind of absurd, you know, just like everyday daily things. Actually, one of my favorite pieces is the Mosler safe. When you see it, you see all this artwork on it. The interior of the doors, there's like 3 layers of doors within the safe, and each surface has art on it, which is completely unnecessary because it's a safe. It would be locked up unless it was opened, in whatever president's office it happened to be. And I need to find out who did the work. Like, was this a contract by contract basis? Were they using art students? Who did the work?
Were there like in-house artists who were
Right.
doing this, or
Exactly. What's
'cause
the story behind that?
it's very ornamental. It is.
Incredibly. And I've seen other Mosler safes that have some decoration on it, but not artwork to this point. So this must have been a special order of some kind. So what was the process of doing that? Who did it? Who are the artists? More questions than I have answers about that. So I just think it's really interesting.
Is it true that the Mosler Safe Company did the doors at Fort Knox?
Yes.
Are those ornamental? Do you think there's artwork on those?
I doubt it.
Do you think we can call them and ask and see if we can see?
You can try.
You're a curator. You're a historian, so they might let you do it.
For research purposes, can I come look at your doors to Fort Knox?
They could quickly Google me and know that they should not let me do it. So
Yeah. Mosler has a really interesting history. One of their safes was actually in Hiroshima, and was not completely destroyed, and they used that in their advertising.
wow.
I believe Mosler did the thing over at the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress for the Constitution that it kind of gets lowered into every night
Oh,
and
cool.
locked up in that. So they've got quite an extensive history.
And we have all this stuff. We're talking about all this because Mosler's a Cincinnati company,
Right.
which is incredible. So is the Mosler safe your favorite object?
It's the one I'm curious the most about, I think. Favorite, that changes day by day. Like right now, that rope piece is my favorite.
The rope is so weird. It's like when teams win the NCAA championship, they all cut a piece of the hoop,
The net, yeah.
the net. I'm fascinated by what the process is to give parts of a noose
Right.
away.
Right.
I
And
mean,
also the part of the story that executions were public.
yeah.
Like, it was, historically, as the farther back you go, they were, I don't want to say entertainment, but they were public spectacles and not just as like a deterrent, right? So there's that story to tell. The fact that the newspaper reported there were about 600 people in the courtyard of the courthouse in attendance at this hanging. So there's that story to tell when you look at how executions are handled today, right? They're not public. They're
Right.
not spectacles.
They talk about screen time being bad for kids, but it could be worse.
Yeah.
They could be going to other events.
Yeah.
Different era.
So yeah, the rope is. I'm also just the ordinary everyday things. I've been reading, on just like the overlooked material culture and just thinking about it. Like pots and pans were a technological invention, right? We used to not be able to boil water. There were cultures that didn't know boiled water, right? And how the invention of a metal pot to boil water revolutionized how we cook. It revolutionized our diet, changed our diet. We went from cooking directly over fire to now we can boil, we can steam, we can saute. It opened up foods that were previously not digestible to humans that, require a lot of boiling. Without the pot, we can't boil beans, the most musical of fruit.
The
Right?
more you eat, yeah.
So that
The more
completely
barrels you
changed.
need.
Beans are now a staple in the human diet. So the pot was a technological innovation that completely changed cooking and eating. And it's just a pot. And do you think that deeply about pots and pans? And you just take that even further to other equipment in your kitchen. Look at what stainless steel, the invention of stainless steel, what it did to our kitchens, completely revolutionized everything, up to and including the kitchen sink. The fork, we used to not eat with forks. We just stabbed food with knives, and the fork changed how we eat and started throwing in etiquette now. And forks on your table represent status and class, how many you have, right? And so the fork can tell all these different stories. So that's where my interest is with objects. The big shiny, those are cool. The famous people, those are cool. But I want to get lost in a rabbit hole around pots and pans. That's
It's
fascinating to me.
it's interesting that we did evolve from the fork to the spork, but it never caught on. That's all fascinating to me. I remember reading a book in college. I think as you grow up, you have a greater appreciation for how smart your professors were and that they assigned certain books for a
Mm-hmm.
reason. And there was a book on cod. I'm like, why am I reading in a history class?
COD?
COD.
Okay.
In a history class, why am I reading
Mm-hmm.
about cod?
Mm-hmm.
And it's this whole story of the pilgrims and why Europeans came to this particular area of America and then what it led to and all these other industries and boom, 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 boom. Similarly, with salt, all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So pots and pans, that's mind blowing because you do take it for granted and you
Yep.
think back different eras. When did they start putting a pot over a fire and not just stabbing a stick
Mm-hmm.
through a
Yeah.
squirrel or something and turning it on a campfire?
Yeah. And I
Uh,
mean, it just kind of goes back, when I said earlier, objects have meaning. Even the ordinary, everyday things that we overlook, there is meaning in it, there is reason in it, there's purpose in it. And if we just think about that, we can just uncover amazing stories to tell.
Sometimes I get very sidetracked in myself and I think, how did I get to this train of thought? And I go back to all the connections. But thinking about the paperclip, for example, why does that
Mm-hmm.
exist? At some point, there was a problem and this was a solution. But
Right.
what were the other ways they were going about it? Or you think about now, if you get coffee anywhere, it says
Yeah.
caution, hot. And, well, yes, absolutely. I mean, we
Right.
have a coffee machine in the break room that will make iced tea as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you select iced tea, and it says careful, contents can be hot. Like, but it's iced tea. But those things are on there for a reason. So then it also tells you a little bit about human nature,
Yeah.
and why these things are necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, you go back to your paperclip example. It met a requirement, but it also tells a larger story of the Industrial Revolution, right? And the growth of the white collar middle class of office workers, right? You had this explosion of office work in mid to late 19th century with industrialization and all of these other connected businesses coming up. So you have, inventions of things like the Wooten desk, which has all these drawers and files within the desk itself. That was invented to address a need, which was the explosion of paper and paper keeping and bookkeeping. And so the paperclip then also is part of that story. So it's not just a little paperclip. There's a story there, there's meaning, there's reason for it. So you just, think, instead of looking past something, if you just stop and think about it, like the paperclip or like pots and pans, there's a lot to learn there.
How often are you stumbling onto something and then just going down a rabbit hole?
All the
where-
time. All the time. It's actually great that my boss is not in the same building as me because the amount of time I'm just like zeroed in on something like this rope. I spent a lot of time just researching this rope. It's like, can we learn more from the rope? Like, how is it made? What is it made of? That sort of thing. But yes, rabbit holes are a byproduct of this job. In
That's
a good
great
way.
way to put it. Yeah.
In a good way. You just go down and you can kind of get a little obnoxious about it too, because you then become the person who says, "Oh, did you know?" Because you went down a rabbit hole at some point about something, and it's now stuck in your brain. Right? You can't remember your parents' phone number, but you do remember this whatever little thing that you
Right.
found on one of your rabbit holes. But that's the fun part, right? I mean, it's better than going to a meeting.
When I've had media interviews and I talk to curators, hey, media is interested in doing a story on this. Can you speak to that? And sometimes they clam up a little bit because they say, I don't know a lot about that. I mean, it's sure it was this and was this and was this, but like, I don't know about that. And I said, that's everything that people want to know. People don't want to know the encyclopedia entry of an event or a person. They want to know those anecdotes, those other details, these quirky, like humanizing stories or aspects to it that make people interested in it. And when I was growing up, I always loved history. And people were like, history. Oh, history's so boring. Until I talked to people who were older, who were in 30s, 40s, 50s, and they say, "Oh, I really wish I would have paid more attention to history because you have to churn through so much history that you
Mhm.
don't get to kind of settle in and hear some of those stories." But if you realize that that's all history really is, it's so fascinating.
History is exciting. History is alive. It's not dead, right? We're still learning about things and researching things and discovering things like the rope, That was a new story that I learned doing the research on that yesterday. History is really exciting. If you think history is boring, then you've had bad teachers, really.
Yeah.
Because this stuff is exciting. They're stories, right? One of the first things we learn as kids to say is, tell me a story. That's history. History is stories. It's based
Yeah.
on fact and evidence, but they're stories. Everything has a story, so.
So how did you get to this point? How did you stumble into where you are now? To
I,
make
bl-
it sound like it was so haphazard. But
I blame Ken Burns,
okay.
honestly. His
Is
Civil
it the
War.
hair? Was it the hair
The
that you're
hair.
blaming?
No. His Civil War documentary came out when I was in high school, and I watched it and I fell in love with it. And it was the storytelling. He took diary entries and letters, layered in a photograph, a little bit of music,
That's what's
and
amazing about it is there's no moving images
no,
of that. It is all static
it's
images, photographs, letters, and it's the
a great
storytelling that
soundtrack.
makes all
Yes.
of that work.
He put it all together in all these layers, and he's got the primary documents. He's got the scholars bringing in context, which is so very important to everything that we do. He's got the primary source documents, people reading the letters and the diaries, looking at the people of these letters and diaries, and just the way he layered storytelling just made it fascinating. And I forget how many episodes this was, but I watched it, and I actually asked for the soundtrack for Christmas that year, which got a weird look from my parents. You want a soundtrack from a PBS documentary? Like, yes, please.
Add a little epic soundtrack to your life.
And that was it. I love history, and studied it in college. History major, English minor. So storytelling has always been a big part of that. And when I graduated from college, the only thing I knew was that I didn't want to teach.
Which
I couldn't spend that much time with children. I know that about myself, and I probably would have just poked a stick in my eye if I had to.
teachers are a special breed.
They
People who
are.
work with children
Oh my
are
God! Yes. Yes.
they have something special to them.
Yep.
So it's very self-aware. I also
Yes.
studied history, and everyone's like, "Oh, do you want to be a teacher?" And I said, "I don't. That's
No.
not really what I want to do."
Right, but then back then, this is back in the '90s, and well, what are you going to do with that? And I was like, I
Back in the
don't
20th century.
I know. It's like, what are you going to do with that? I was like, I don't know. And then I had an internship. This was up in Michigan. I had an internship one summer with the Grand Rapids city historian. And I was like, you can do history outside of a classroom, right? And so he introduced me to this idea of public history and the doing of history in public, right? Through museums, historical societies, libraries, archives, corporate collections, grant writing, historic preservation. There's all different ways you can do history in the public. And then so he steered me to a great graduate program down in Indianapolis. Studied public history there, got an internship at the Indiana State Museum that led to a part-time job that then became a full-time job that I had for 21 years, I think it was, until I came down here.
Wow.
So Ken Burns.
So you were kind of just a straight line.
Yeah. I didn't know it was museums necessarily that I wanted to do. That's kind of where my internships led me to. Internships are great things. They tell you what you like to do, but I think most importantly, and I tell my interns this, they tell you what you don't like.
Exactly.
And I had a few archival interns, and I'm sorry, Christine and Sarah, but archives is not my thing. I learned that. Working in small museums, not my thing. So when I got the internship at the State Museum, at the Indiana State Museum, it's like, this is great. I get to play with stuff, things, objects. I love it. And that was it.
So do you have a particular era of history, particular story from history that's your favorite, or does it change moment by moment?
It changes all the time, which is what's great about my job. I'm a generalist, right? So my knowledge is a mile wide and an inch deep, and it needed to be, right? For 20 years, I was at the Indiana State Museum. I collected Indiana history statewide with more general Midwestern regional history, as the context. So that's kind of where my knowledge is in very specific in Indiana, but then more generally the Midwest. So now I need to learn that about Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky in this region as well. So, but you need to know a little bit about a lot of things. And then you get to do those deep dives when you're working on a project or on an exhibit. At my previous job, I curated an exhibit on James Dean.
Oh,
He was
cool.
from Fairmount, Indiana.
Was he?
So I know more than I need to know about James Dean now. So you get to do these deep dives on a project basis, or when you get that object or collection that allows you to go really deep, you kind of become a little bit of a mini expert on that subject or that thing. So that's the fun part of it, is you get to know a little bit about everything. But since my collection kind of runs the gamut, both subject-wise from, popular culture to politics, military, business, industry, furniture, clothing, jewelry, silver, fine art, you kind of have to just know a little bit here and there, but then as a trained historian, you know where to look to find the deeper information as well.
Just like a mathematician, they know formulas and they know how to find the answer to a question. It's the stereotypical question. If train A is coming from Chicago at 60 miles an hour and train B is coming from Baltimore at 80 miles an hour, where are they going to meet? And you have to know how to build that formula and find that answer. As a historian, you have to know how to do research and where all the dots connect. And that is a skill. It's not just simply you're researching the question. Let me find the right book that has this information and read it. You have to connect all those dots together.
Right. So I think the important skills in my job are you have to be a good historian. You have to be able to communicate well, both written and orally, right? You have to tell that story. And then object literacy is also part of it. You need to know objects and be able to evaluate objects and contextualize objects. And that comes just through doing the job. There's only so much you can get through your education. You just have to do the job to get good at the job. So that object literacy is like the third part of it. But you put these three things together so that you can tell that story either in articles or on podcasts or, in exhibits, programs, that sort of thing, is you have to be able to connect all of that.
And you're part psychologist as well, because when you're looking at objects, you're studying human nature, and you're some things. So if there's a bedpost and it has, carvings in it or something, and you think, well, what could this have been? What does this mean? And you realize, it's a child's bed, and they probably, they were doodling on it, or they script. It's you put yourself in that context, and that is sort of how you start to hypothesize what that could be.
Right.
The answer's not always right there. You have to know people, and human nature doesn't drastically change throughout history.
Right. So, like, if you look at the Boyd bedstead that's on exhibit, you'll see these repetitive wear marks on the frame of it, and that's from the ropes. Rope beds.
Yeah.
We don't have now. We have bed frames that are a little bit differently, but beds used to have a rope structure, and that's the wear of the ropes. So knowing that about bed construction in the early 19th century, that's exactly what that is, where someone might not know that and wonder what those marks were made from. So it tells you the wear of the thing, right? If a bedstead doesn't have those marks, then it likely wasn't used very often.
People always say we've got it so much easier. Technology today and all this other stuff has improved and has made life easier. Could you imagine not having to move a box spring and just having to uncoil rope when you moved your bed? That would be a dream.
Yeah.
I mean,
it would not be comfortable to sleep on, but moving would be a little easier.
There'd be so many fewer box springs on the side of the highway.
Right.
I've never had to put a mattress on top of my car, but I did
Mm.
buy a Christmas tree, a real Christmas tree at a lot, and tied it to the top
Mhm.
of my sedan once, like an idiot. Tied the car doors closed, so I had to, I rolled the windows down so I could loop the rope through
Mhm.
and everything.
Couldn't
And
get in your car.
I was like, "Great, thanks. I'll see you later." And then I stand at my car, so I got the you feel cool for a minute,
Oh, do the
like
Dukes of Hazzard
yeah,
thing?
doing the Dukes of Hazzard, kind of entering the car door. But then it got worse from there because I picked a tree that had a crooked trunk and it fell it fell over twice. But anyway, I don't think I'd
Yeah.
have been a good pioneer.
No, but then now that Christmas and that tree has meaning because you have a story to tell.
That's true. That's true. Do you want an old Chevy Malibu for the collection? So
Full of pine needles?
yeah,
No, thank you.
pine needle and baked beans, but that's a different story. So is in the different exhibits and the different research moments and opportunities you've been a part of, is there a favorite that stands out to you, or one that you're most proud of,
Um,
either here or
mhm.
at the Indiana State Museum?
They're all fun and enjoyable in their own way. But to be honest, and I think a lot of people will tell you this, doing an exhibit is a journey. It takes a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of focus, and at the end of it, you're usually sick and tired of that subject.
So it's not
So,
the exhibit itself; it's the
yeah,
research you learn along the way.
yeah, I think it becomes a bit of a like a trigger when it comes up. So, but with distance, you begin to appreciate it again. The James Dean exhibit was great. It was fun. I got to work with a bunch of old guys up in Fairmount, Indiana, who quote unquote ran the Fairmount History Museum, but I think they just came together every morning to shoot the shit
Yeah,
and drink coffee and stuff like that. But
sure.
they were great. They were wonderful to work with. His cousin, who owns all the material, still lives in Fairmount, and he has it on exhibit at the Fairmount History Museum. And so I went up there to review and borrow some things, and they were really fascinated with how I was doing my job, and they really paid attention. And we did the exhibit, and it was great, and I returned all the stuff. Came back a couple of years later to borrow something for the Indiana Bicentennial exhibit we were working on, and I went up there again, and they had redone their display. The objects are basically in trophy cases. It's a typical small town museum. But they had redone the shelves and they completely reprinted every single label following how I did it in
Oh,
my
that's great.
exhibit.
Yeah.
And so they actually learned by watching me do what I did. And that was just the best compliment I've ever gotten professionally, was that they learned from me on how to make their presentation a little bit better. That was, wonderful. I co-curated a retrospective of the work of an Indianapolis photographer by the name of Bill Foley, who's since become a really good friend of mine. And we worked together daily, almost just going through the tens of thousands of photo negatives he had. He worked in the Middle East during the late 70s and 80s, won a Pulitzer Prize, and just working with the subject. He's the first living person that I've done an exhibit on.
Wow.
That collaborative process was really energizing and fun, and getting to hear from him the stories of the photographs instead of me just researching and assigning those stories to them. That was interesting. So they're all in their own little way really interesting and fun to work on, and they all have meaning. Made in Cincinnati, I came in right at the tail end of that, but just kind of coming up to speed on that, and seeing kind of the interpretive view that we took with it, this idea of innovation, even no matter how small, changing the world like a lot of these things have. That's been fun and interesting to really dive into and give that particular view of Cincinnati history through an innovation lens, right? Not just through this big production lens, but what are the innovations that were driving all of this? That's an interesting viewpoint to really kind of dive into. So that's been fun, just catching up to speed on that. But yeah, they're all fun and interesting, and the diversity is what really makes the job enjoyable. I don't do the one thing over and over again 5 days a week. every year for the rest of my life. I get to bounce around from subject and material, object, daily, weekly, you know, it's just all different. And that diversity, I think, is good for my brain.
Yeah.
If I had to do the same thing every day, I couldn't do that. So bouncing around is a lot of fun.
Well, diversity from another perspective, where a lot of marginalized voices don't show up in written documents as
Right.
much, are objects a place where we do see a little more diversity, where we do see more stories of people who have traditionally been kind of on the margins of textbooks and history books.
Yeah. So diversity is something a lot of museums are grappling with now. Most museums don't have a very diverse collection, and you can define diversity every way that you can think of, right? Through race, gender, class. Most museums tell a fairly uniform story. We have what I would call a traditional collection, which skews very white, very male, very middle and upper class, which is all museums. They have that problem. So now the emphasis, rightly so, is in catching up with a lot of those overlooked stories and overlooked communities and diversifying the collection to tell those stories. I often think, I say to people, if an alien came into Cincinnati tomorrow and studied humanity from our collection, what is the
How do you
picture?
know they haven't?
There's a rabbit hole again. What is the story?
Yeah.
What is the picture they're going to get of what Cincinnati has been? It's going to be a very uniform picture. So we need to tell a more complete story because there are more stories here that need to be told. So collecting things from those overlooked communities and just areas that haven't gotten the attention, I think. So we have women represented fairly well in the collection, but women from the standpoint of being wives and mothers, and professionally teachers and nurses. Women have done a lot more than that in the world. They've been in many professional fields. We need to document that. So move beyond the traditional to, all of those other stories. So yeah, we and all of the museums need to diversify their collections, and we just need to be a little more proactive about that and going out and, working with these communities and letting them know that, we value your story and we want to be able to tell your story. So going out and making those connections with these communities and hopefully bringing them into both, with objects and also archives as well. Really just documenting them as completely as possible.
And sometimes you're not going to be able to go back in time and recoup that.
Right.
But this moment right now is going to be history for someone else.
Yes.
And there are people alive today who live through historic events who still can tell that story for us now. Yeah. So it's never too late to really make that effort, to make that shift. Right. And sometimes, as you said, it's educating people what objects are. Yeah. People may think, well, I don't have anything that could help tell that. You don't know that. They just may not be thinking of objects in that way.
Right. And history, people have an idea of history, but it's also kind of relative. You just said, tell the story of people live through historical events. That's us. Yeah. The three of us in this room right now lived through a pretty major historical event with COVID. And we were collecting COVID in the moment, right? We were capturing objects and stories while it was happening with a view to 50 years from now when they do that 50-year anniversary exhibit on COVID. What are we going to have in the collection? So we were collecting those stories and we were collecting those objects in the moment. Yes, as we get farther from it, more stories are going to be revealed to us that then we need to collect, right? So in the moment collecting, you've got a very kind of myopic view of things, right? You got the blinders on of what's in front of you. The more distance you get from it, you're going to get the kind of context in some of these other storylines that were kind of going on. So we will continue to collect COVID as these storylines and objects, kind of bubble to the surface. But that we were collecting real time. So history isn't a long time ago. History is also now when we can recognize it and capture it. So that's important, is to let people know what you have is important. I tell people all the time when they call me and I have to turn them down. And, I'm like, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say no, because I would rather say no than having missed out on something that was never offered. So, yes, what you have, call. Let me know. It may or may not be something we're looking for. Sometimes it's, there's a story that you want to document. It's like, what is the object? Well, I'll know it when I see it, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we'll go to people's houses and kind of look through their stuff of what they have, because they don't know what I'm looking for, and I don't always know what I'm looking for until I see it sometimes. But yeah, there are, storylines that we can be capturing now before, the living memory, starts to disappear.
Right. As we're recording this, we're very close to the 80th anniversary of D-Day.
Mm-hmm.
And you do the math and you figure the youngest person who is storing the beaches on D-Day, 18, maybe 17, 16. But today, they're in their late 90s. Even their kids are, in their 80s. And so that starts to slip away quicker than you think. As those generations slip away and as you get further away from it, that memory starts to go with it. History moves pretty quickly, and it changes pretty quickly. And if you're not documenting, if you're not telling the stories, if someone's not doing that work, those are lost. If it just lives in the minds or the memories of a couple people, then you get a very skewed, very limited view of what that is. So having a breadth and having more people's voices in the collections and telling those stories, I think is so important.
Yeah, we want to tell as complete a story as we can. We can't save everything and collect everything, but we can do a better story of representing the breadth of experiences that have made Cincinnati.
Before we go on so long that Mitch makes us put the microphones themselves in the collections, if you had to trade roles with anyone in the museum for a day, who would you trade roles with?
Our CFO, Jill. And I would reallocate Fancy Jill. I would reallocate all the money to the collections department.
So you have an ulterior motive for your selection.
Yes.
Okay, that's smart.
Yes, I would, elevate a few salaries here and there. Yeah.
So then flip it. If you could make anyone do your job for a day, who would you make do your job?
Oh, goodness.
Either who would you let do your job or who would you make do it?
Who would I make do it? On the days... Oh, see, this could get... So on the days of heavy lifting, dirty things that get really sweaty... Gosh, I don't know. Who's somebody who dresses up every day? I don't know. That would be interesting. That could be a bit of a punishment to somebody. I think
Whitney dresses up every day for the most part, right?
I could, but she's my boss, so I don't want to be that mean.
You're very savvy in your hypotheticals.
As far as I would love for the floor staff who work in the History Museum every day to come in here and do my job and get to be with the objects the way that I do, since they're the ones on the floor talking about the objects. I think bringing them in behind the scenes and doing what I do a little bit, I would like to see that. So, yeah, I think I have a great job. I'm not tarring roofs in August, out in the hot, sweaty sun. I'm playing with rope. I'm, acquiring a hearse. I'm, sewing tags onto the backs of wedding dresses. It's not back-breaking work. It is really, really fun.
You have an incredible list of other duties as assigned.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Just wait until we get someone's shed and it needs a new roof on it before we can put it on display.
Yeah.
And you have to reshingle it.
No. No. But yeah, it's a great job, and the things I sometimes find myself doing, I'm like, I went to grad school for this? When I'm using a little tiny paintbrush to dust a streetcar, and it's like, yep. Although I am getting paid to do that, so
that's true. That's true.
That's all part of it. But yes, other duties as assigned is very interesting in this job.
And maybe that's what we should have named the podcast. Other duties as assigned. Can we? Maybe that's like a season 2 thing.
There you go.
Well, Catherine, thanks so much for spending time with us. This has been a lot of fun. And thank you all for listening to Meanwhile at the Museum. Remember, if you liked what you heard, please rate and subscribe, but more importantly, come see for yourself. Visit cincymuseum.org to see the latest reasons to visit. If you have any questions, comments, or just want to tell us how much you love the show, send us an email at meanwhile@cincymuseum.org. Thanks for listening.